Thanks very much for joining us today. Welcome to the third and final Industry and Academy Roundtable of the semester. I'm Elizabeth Hunter in the School of Theater and Dance at San Francisco State, and I'm the director of this series. My partner on the series, Emily Bedix, is in the audience today. She joins us from the Longmore Institute on Disability. And we'd like to thank the College of Liberal and Creative Arts and the CSU Entertainment Alliance for their continued support of this roundtable series. And today's roundtable is funded by an Extraordinary Ideas Grant. And Josh Davis in the Department of Journalism collaborated with Emily and me today for today's roundtable on the journalism of the future. And we're delighted to have a few industry partners with us today. They are Reed Albergotti, who writes about technology for the Washington Post. Thank you for being here today, Reed. Lawrence Carter-Long, who's Director of Communications for the Disability Rights Education and Defense Fund. And Ericka Cruz Guevarra, who's producer and host of the Bay podcast on KQED. And she is a proud SFSU grad. Go Gators. Thank you for being here today. Well, usually what we do is we move through questions that our panelists have submitted in advance. Questions, provocations, thoughts about our subject, which is the future of journalism and journalism of the future. And then at the end, we'll have a few minutes for Q&A, and then afterwards we'll circulate. And if you have questions for our industry panelists, please do ask them, especially students who might have networking questions. Please ask your questions of our panelists. So I want to start with Josh's question, which is, how is new technology reimagining broadcast news? What do we think, panelists? How is new technology reimagining broadcast news?
It's very similar to my, should I hold this? Hello. It's actually very similar to my question, which is, how is new technology changing the way the news sounds? And I think this is definitely something that we're thinking about at KQED, which, is this thing that you hear on like the oldest form of technology, like a radio. As someone who's working in podcasting, this is a huge question that a lot of public radio stations are grappling with. And I think technology and how people are accessing the news, which is now on their phones, is changing how we think about how we need to reach people. So I would say technology and the fact that a lot of people are getting their news on the phone is changing our format. That we're not, we're not doing the newscast at 9 o'clock in the morning and that's it. We have to make something that will last a little bit longer. And so on the Bay, we, do that. It's sort of like a daily news podcast, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and we're thinking about the biggest stories of the week and are trying to reimagine what that sounds like. So it's a more highly produced thing. There's music, and it just sounds a little bit different from what the news generally sounds like, which is very, sort of formal and top of the hour newscast. So I would say people are getting a lot more creative about what the news sounds like because of changing technology.
Well, maybe I'll talk about, even though I'm not a broadcast journalist, I work for a print newspaper, which is really now only printed in the Washington, D.C. area. Everything else is online. But in our office in San Francisco, we have 15 people, and 2 of them are video people. So they're essentially broadcast journalists, and they go out and do their own reporting. They come up with their own stories, but they also work on video projects that accompany our articles. And that's always one of the questions when we do a piece is there a video possibility here? Is there a video component? And I think that's true in a lot of print newsrooms. We also have our daily podcast, the Post Reports, and we have a broadcast room that's connected to the networks. Like the network stations can actually control the camera remotely from inside our special studio. So it kind of feels at times like that barrier between print and broadcast is just going away because of technology.
in your newsroom that people can watch y'all working?
No. Sorry, that was confusing.
It's like the camera at the zoo.
That's terrifying.
It's just the Truman Show in the Washington Post. No, we have a room that you go into, and it's all, it's sound. It's got the sound dampening walls and everything. It's dark. And you flip the switch, and the on-air light comes on, and then there's just this camera. You've probably seen these before. If most journalists have probably seen these things in these remote broadcast studios,
Right.
and you sit in a chair, you mic yourself up, and you hear the person at the station saying, "Okay, can you move this way or that?" And the camera adjusts itself. They adjust it remotely, and then boom, you're on CNN or whatever, and you never have to leave the office. So it's just my whole point is that technology makes it possible to kind of I still consider myself a print journalist, and I care the most about the printed, the written stories that I write. But as a news outlet, it's just how can we reach our readers, and what format's the best depending on the story you're writing. We don't, as an organization, care as much about whether we're a print newspaper or not. We're just telling stories and tell them in many different ways now, and it's because of technology.
That's so interesting.
Yeah, I think. Do you want to go?
Oh, go ahead.
Okay, from an advocacy perspective, because I've been on both sides of the table. I was a producer and host of a radio show in New York City for 6 years, a thing called The Largest Minority. It was about disability issues. And now, after having worked for the federal government for 6 years, 2.5 years ago, came back to doing advocacy work and pitching and placing stories. So I've seen the spectrum, and I've been involved in the spectrum of how the stories get told and when, what time. And one of the things I find most interesting, to piggyback a bit on what you said, was, when I lived in Washington, D.C., when a story would come up and CNN would want us for something, I'd have to get a car, get downtown, go to the station, get inside the little closet, which is very similar, I think, to what you're talking about, right? They'd mic me up, and then we'd be off to the races. What I've found is happening more and more these days is, one, the speed is much faster. Like you're expected to jump on it right away, and rather than do that story in 3 days, you did it in 3 hours. And the last one I did that was international, I did with Al Jazeera, based on what drives the news. This story was based on tweets that went viral. And they were talking about are the kinds of ways we tend to represent disability, are they useful or are they harmful? I did that. I don't live in DC anymore, right? So I did that interview from my desk in my office using Skype, right? Mm-hmm. And that just never would have happened 10 years ago. Nobody, even if the technology had existed, I think the producers wouldn't have gone for it. But there was no way to get me to DC. They wanted to do it right away. Did it right there from my desk. Mm-hmm. I think the speed and so the delivery methods have changed quite a bit.
Yeah, and I'd speak with the speed of it too. When I was at Vice, and I know a lot of newspapers and broadcast organizations do this now, but we have a little backpack called a LiveU, L-I-V-E-U, and we can feed all of our footage direct to the control room, and it's just a small backpack. It weighs 10 pounds, and it enables you to essentially, push your news directly to the editor in real time, immediately as you're filming it. So what that enabled us to do at Vice was to produce these short form, 20-minute documentaries over the course of 24 or 48 hours, which you talk about print moving to video, which is really, really helpful for the survival of newspapers and traditional publications. But it's also this evolution of video, right? This evolution of you don't need a satellite truck and to talk in that news speak your local news in order to feed footage back. You can have documentary filmmakers working for broadcast news stations like we had at Vice, and you can work at that metabolism, and the technology can kind of keep up with the ideas of what you want to do. But I piggyback too. The reason I actually posted this question to Ericka, you kind of nailed it, is with the sound, the voice, what it's not just technology that drives the reimagining of traditional broadcast radio, TV, but it's like thinking about how do we actually like break the wall between reporters and our subjects, our audiences. And I think a lot of it really just comes down to voice and like how we talk to people. And that's been a big thing the last few years, and you see it with Vice, you see it with the New York Times, with the Weekly. You definitely see it with podcasts because they invented that. But it's just taking that news speak away and talking in ways that are accessible to audiences that more mimic the way that people talk to each other now. On Twitter, on the phone, on every other like communication device that you have, and the news has to do that.
And that can I grab this mic? Thank you. These threads are kind of coming together in a way that brings me to Reed's question, which I'll put up in just a second because it's such a kind of bombshell that it'll be we'll all groan about like, oh yes, I know, it's awful. But thinking about how new technology and this sense of immediacy and casualness and right there-ness that new technology is supporting is leading to what is fake news, what counts as real news, how with this sense of it happened right there and there was less of a filter and it was just yesterday. There's no more mediation anymore between a formal newscaster and a little bit of temporal distance, but now it's all right there. Plus the technology is advancing so quickly that it's hard for us to tell with deepfakes what's real and what's not. How help us, Reed? What is fake?
I think it's a good question. I'm not sure that was actually my question though, but
it is now. See, fake news really in the moment. I said it was Reed's question. We're gonna edit that out.
That's very meta. That's very meta. I really like it. But I mean, it is. I think a topic that we care a lot about at the Washington Post. We've been writing a lot about the deepfake issue, which I don't know if you probably all know what it is, but in case you don't, it's where people take videos and edit them to make someone look as if they're saying something that they didn't say. And that technology is still kind of, I think I can tell if you look closely, but sometimes it's very subtle. Like the Washington Post broke a story about a Nancy Pelosi video that was edited where it wasn't really a deep fake. They really just kind of slowed the video down just ever so slightly to make her look as if she was not all there, or maybe she was drunk or something like that. That story got a lot of attention. But then, of course, you hear the president call any story that's critical of him is fake news. So they've kind of, that term has now sort of taken on two different meanings depending on where your politics are. No, I mean, we hear it all the time, and people make jokes about it now. I mean, it's like, oh, I work for the Washington Post, and people will joke, oh, fake news, because that's what the president says. I don't know if that really answers my question, but since it's my question, you should answer.
Maybe I wanted you to answer the question, which you did so admirably. What do y'all think? How do we deal with, especially in a student-centered context where you're teaching students how to make the news, the tools that are available for the news, how to be consumers of the news? How does this question come up in your classes, Professor?
I have some of my students here, maybe they can answer that. But I mean, in a nutshell, there's so many places where you can get information, and it's not always directly from the traditional reliable news source, and it's identifying what is a credible news organization and what is not, and that can be really tricky. And there's gray areas, and there's advocacy group and advocacy journalism, and then there's just like, I'm trying to remember the Steve Bannon quote. It was like something along the lines of like, flood the zone with, can we swear? SHIT.
Right. That's the approach. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, there's like, I think people, media consumers, students, journalists have to be aware that there's, and I think we are to a pretty large extent, that there's a very concerted effort out there to, I flood the zone with shit, to, to provide as much disinformation as possible in order to be able to claim fake news about something that is critical of a person or an issue that that you support. So, Ericka, do you have anything on this?
Do I? I mean, I think even as someone who works in the news, I myself am overwhelmed by this question. It's a really tough thing because, as we're talking about how technology is changing journalism, it has created such a space where we are getting the news that we want to hear, maybe instead of the news that we need to hear. And, I see family and friends on Facebook who are posting things from, websites like AmericanFreedom.org about some political thing. And I don't know, it's overwhelming and it's scary to me. And I think it's really, I try to impress upon family members to really understand where you're getting your news and who is behind that. And I think some Washington Post reporter had said, the 2016 election, it will be misinformation and fake news will be the issue, in terms of how consumers are, receiving their political information. So I think it's just about being aware of the sources and being a reporter in some ways, about the reporting that you are reading. So.
Can I add one thing? I think there is, the term sort of came up in the 2016 election because of disinformation on Facebook, spread by Russia, and those were just clearly hoax. There were these hoax news articles that were circulating around, and there's a debate how that affected the results of the election. So that has led to another, I think, which is related, another debate over Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, which it's unbelievable that CDA 230, as it's called for short, has now become, I think, just part of the lexicon if you're following the news. Such an arcane issue. But basically, the way all these tech companies, these platforms like Facebook grew to be so large is that this law, this provision in the law, allows them it gives them, total immunity from anything that's published on their platforms, more or less, as long as they're a neutral platform. So they not only are they not liable, but really they have no incentive other than public relations to try and police this stuff on their platforms, and that's allowed it to spread through Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, you name it. Now even TikTok. So I think to me the fake news debate, the true fake news, just hoax articles, is now going to become a debate about accountability for tech platforms. And then the other thing I think is really interesting on this topic is, I don't know if you've been following Bloomberg's satire, but he's been, he's put out a video where it was a doctored version of the debate in Nevada, Democratic debate in Nevada, and kind of showed all of these candidates doing these awkward pauses, and it was totally edited, completely untrue. And then there was another one where it was on Twitter, his campaign posted a bunch of Bernie Sanders quotes about dictators, from Fidel Castro to Kim Jong-un, and they were totally made up quotes. And what the Bloomberg campaign says is this is satire, but it's in very small letters.
Right.
And so I guess the question is, do they mean it as satire, or are they hoping that people will read this and be confused and they could get votes that way, but at the same time they can kind of wash their hands of it? I think that's an interesting question as well.
Yeah, and it's depressing. It's overwhelming and depressing, and as we're kind of going through the growing pains of thinking about what these new technologies can are unleashing on us in terms of expanded access to folks who maybe are without filter and without ethics posting, there is maybe a way we can start also thinking about the new ways that these technologies have expanded access to underrepresented voices on the bright side, to look at things on the bright side. And this brings me to Lawrence's question, which is, how has tech helped reporters tell better stories about disability?
Yeah, and traditionally, and I'm talking going back throughout history for millennia, right? Disability stories have tended to be either those tragic stories, like this person that was impacted by that horrible thing, they got hit by a bus or whatever it might be, incident or accident, or the flip side of that same coin, which is sort of that overcoming narrative, right? That this disabled person got out of bed that morning and wow, isn't it amazing, right? So it's not really directly tied to any specific program, campaign, business, whatever it might be. It's just this disabled person living their life is somehow seen as miraculous. And those stories tended to be echo chambers, right? The more you see those stories, the more you begin to think that if you're a disabled person, the only job you can get is as an inspirational speaker, because that's the only place that you see disabled people. And so what's occurred through time, which is very fascinating and I think a necessary evolution, is how social media in particular has changed the kinds of stories that get told. So for example, it was very common, remains very common for news outlets to do kind of these feel-good stories come April or May each year. We call them the Promposal Stories, right? Where the cheerleader asks the guy with Down syndrome to go to the prom, or the football player asks the guy with Down syndrome, with autism, to go to the prom, or something like that. And instead of telling, those stories are easy to tell. They're 2 minutes, they're feel-good pieces, you're not expected to dig any deeper into them, right? But what has started to happen with social media is that if somebody sees a promposal story, they can tweet directly the editor, directly the reporter, whomever it might be, the headline writer, if they get something wrong, and say, wait a minute, instead of doing this feel-good story about, and I've seen these before. There was one in Texas a couple of months back where this guy with Down syndrome who was in his mid-20s had a food truck. They interviewed his mother, they interviewed his father, they interviewed the Better Business Bureau. Nobody interviewed the guy who owned the business, right? And so disabled people become props in their own stories in these pieces. And so what's happened is social media in particular has democratized that process a little bit better. Somebody does a promposal story or does a story where they don't interview the owner of the business, people could say, why didn't you interview the owner of the business, right? And all of a sudden, there's some accountability there. Or you can say, instead of doing this feel-good promposal story, ask why the disabled people are having a separate prom than the rest of their peers, right? What's the deeper story there? What's the story that hasn't been told within this? And those are being driven by the disability community itself. It happened just last year with the fires and the electricity shutdowns with PG&E. If you used a ventilator, your life was literally at risk. There was no plan in place from PG&E to protect people or to get them generators or to make sure generators were available. A handful of disability advocates, Stacey Park and some other folks in and around the Bay Area, took to the internet, took to Twitter and started organizing themselves, which they became viral, which drove the news cycle, which then the news reporters had to tell those stories, right? And so it's really a situation where people are taking the bull by the horns themselves and saying, wait a minute, this has been ignored. No one's addressing this. If you use a ventilator, it's a life or death situation. We're going to make sure this story gets told. And then putting it out there, giving the people the tools that they need and the foundation really in order to build upon and tell the story. And that went on for a number of months.
I feel like there's a similar thing kind of happening with stories about people of color in the media. You'll always see, if someone New York Times, writes a story about boba is this thing that was just discovered, that we just discovered boba.
You
And
just
they're
discovered
just-
boba. Yeah, right.
And immediately on Twitter, like people of color, folks who've been drinking boba for years, drag them because and point out this is a perfect example of how non-diverse your newsroom is to publish a headline like that. And I think with that particular story, because of the backlash that it got on Twitter and on social media, and the New York Times changed the headline. So I feel like there's definitely some crossover there. You see a lot of people who maybe before never felt like they had a say in whatever the New York Times was publishing, or what stories they were telling, or what or how they were represented in the news, even have a little bit more access because of technology, because of Twitter, to the reporters, to the editors, to the editorial board, to say this is wrong, and we don't have a seat at the table in your editorial staff, but we have a seat at the table on Twitter, and we're gonna get 500,000 retweets on this thing so that you could change that headline.
And those retweets, right, are keeping newsrooms accountable, which in a way that we've never really seen before.
Yes.
Yeah.
Totally.
Yeah, I think you can't really discount how much the bubbling up on social media does to help drive news. I mean, there's traditional agenda setting where it's it really, I've seen it. There are people at the New York Times or in newsrooms in general where they see something for the first time and then it's a thing. It's like the Times is on it, right? It's like if the Time, it doesn't exist unless the Times reports on it.
Sorry, Reed.
It's a paper record.
Yeah,
What can I say?
but with all respect to the Times, but there are those instances, right? And there's reasons for that. But the last newsroom I was in, it was probably one of the most diverse newsrooms I'm in, and I just think you need that, right? You need that diversity in the newsroom for someone to be like, hey, boba's a thing, and people are going to start paying triple the times for boba now because you're reporting on it, and that's kind of what happens, right? But it also, it's not just for good too. I mean, when I was at Vice, we reported on extremism and white supremacy, and it was a beat that came out of our technology beat actually, but it was reporting on all this online platforming of hate. And when that started going offline in real spaces, we were reporting on that. Ultimately, that led to us reporting in Charlottesville. But it's, some social media, it's so great for people of color, people with disabilities, people who have legitimate concerns, but need some, more people to attract to, to get things to trend and to bubble up. But unfortunately, that can also, as we see every day on Twitter, that can turn into also to hate speech, and it's happening now a lot more than it used to.
Absolutely, and I think that one of the maybe unintended side effects that is especially interesting for me in thinking about how new technologies are amplifying underrepresented voices, but also offering a promise of understanding underrepresented voices in a new way through empathy as afforded by virtual reality and augmented reality. This notion of, and this is my question, so let me put mine, boom. Do these technologies of virtual reality, which is of course the headset that you put on and all you can see inside is a 360-degree built digital environment. Augmented reality, the terms are in flux, but augmented reality, when you lift your phone up and through the viewer of your phone window, you can see holograms that seem to be populating your space, or maybe a mixed reality or spatial computing headset, which you put on and you can still see the room around you, but now there are holograms that seem to be in your space around you. And a lot of the language that I see around these technologies is offering this promise of creating empathy through technology, because now you can occupy the point of view or the perspective or the true life experience of an underrepresented person until you want to take the headset off.
Right.
And so I that is interesting to me in terms of thinking about how that's impacting journalism and how news outlets are using these technologies with this promise of empathy. And so I wonder if we could just brainstorm on that for a minute, because it's promising, and also I'm deeply skeptical.
I would sort of make it, my caution here, and again, it's all in play right now, so nobody has all the answers, but my caution is, for decades, the standard in sort of understanding the disability experience would be to sit in a wheelchair for a day or wear a blindfold for an hour, right? And that can only get you so far. I think the danger with those approaches are that you take your hour, you spend your day with your augmented reality, and you think you know everything, right? I think I do wonder, though, if there are ways that we can make these things work. And it seems to me a combination of approaches is warranted in order to really make it meaningful, right? So you can maybe get a better sense of what it might be to have this or that kind of sensory disability through the use of these devices. But you're not going out to the job interview the day after, right? And so it seems to me that it's important when these things are done, if they're done. I think what I would try doing right now is to make sure that there are real life people who have those conditions helping you unpack and understand the context in which what you just experienced happens on a day-to-day basis, right? So keep it real in terms of unpacking how you can apply that sensory thing you just felt for 45 minutes to the rest of society or to someone's day or someone's regular life. Yeah.
I think that virtual reality, it still hasn't quite caught on. So I don't know if we know the answers to it, but it seems to me like the way people are using it right now is sort of a video game device, right? To have fun and have a diversion. It would be great. I think it would be great if people wanted to use it to really immerse themselves in a story in a way that maybe you can't with a two-dimensional TV screen or a written article. And I've done some of the sample projects where, your journalists have used it to kind of bring you to, the shores of some place in Europe where there are refugees, coming ashore. And you get a sense of what it's like, and I think that's really cool. But I think the technology is also a long way away, especially for MR, XR, where you're like you described, seeing the world, and then the images are being transmitted. That seems way off. Just from my own reporting on the a pair of glasses that you can wear that look like this, that project the world, project images onto the world. It's just like at this point, science fiction.
The flying cars. We've been promised those flying cars for 50 years.
Yes, it's in the category of fun. And I think in 50 years we'll be saying we've been promised self-driving cars for 50 years. But I think VR could be around the corner, and I think that's something that people may use for entertainment in their living rooms. And I personally, as a journalist, I'm excited. I don't think it's there yet. I don't think it's arrived yet, but I think it would be great for those kinds of stories.
This reminds me of your other question that you asked, Josh, about let's say VR does come around, or my dream of the augmented reality headset that looks like my glasses happens in my lifetime, that if we've got those tools as part of the story, and maybe we've still, in the DC area, got the print version of the post, and we've got our phones, and we've got social media, what is the impact of stories across these platforms on journalism? It's Josh's question.
Yeah, so I guess I should answer it. Or pose a general talking point to the rest of the group, because I'm curious to know what that everyone thinks. But it's a good segue, because I think the general idea is like you want to meet people where they're at, right? So finding ways to get people are on their phones, right? So you want to find ways to create content for digital spaces. So it's not just the newspaper, right? Like that's why we're producing videos, producing podcasts, and everything else. And so I think, in terms of like the impact of multi-platform storytelling, what this allows us to do content-wise, so we can find ways to like actually like reach our audiences, right, through the phone or other digital spaces. But content-wise, I think we can now find like the ways that we can best tell our stories. And so I teach a class where we specifically look at these things, and my students are coming to me and they're like, here's this idea, and I'm like, all right, are you thinking like print or text, radio, like audio, video, and they're not always thinking about that yet, but it's like, okay, like I'll get a pitch and it's like, this is a really good podcast idea, but it's not a video idea because we don't have the visuals, but there's this backstory that's so rich and they talk about it so, with such like enthusiasm that this lends itself to audio. So I think it can enhance our storytelling and it can create ways that we can reach audiences. But I'll kind of leave it there because I'm curious what everyone else thinks.
Yeah, I mean, we see that happening, right? We see that in terms of post reports or the daily, all of those sort of take those stories that you might have seen the headline on. And if you're inclined or interested, we'll help unpack those, right? And what I like about them, particularly to bring it back to my work and to disability, is that, again, there's a double-edged sword here, but one can customize the delivery method that works best for them, right? So if your screen reader is a little wonky and it doesn't really like the New York Times website, you can listen to a podcast, right? So if you're blind and that screen reader is not quite working and you prefer to take that in by listening to the podcast, you have that option available to you now. And more media content producers are cross-pollinating in those ways. And so I think whereas, you used to have to rely on the serendipity of flipping the page to maybe stumbling across a story that you would like, that you didn't look for, you didn't know you wanted to read, but you turned to page 4 and there it is. If that gets enough traction, that's going to rise to the top. That's going to trend. That's going to be the subject of the podcast, maybe, that you listen to. And maybe you found out about that because somebody tweeted about it, right? So I think the interesting way that these things tend to work in terms of the viewer or the listener is how one thing leads to another. And there's no real set way that works. It's mix and match for all of them.
I will say, in the world of daily news podcasts and what we're doing in terms of what we're doing at KQED, working on a news podcast is absolutely changing the way we're telling stories, because now we're thinking about kind of speaking to what you were saying earlier, Josh, breaking down the wall between the consumer and the reporter or the host. We always kind of talk about, whenever we get a reporter in to talk about a story that they're working on, we're getting them to talk about, well, how did you feel when you walked into that city council meeting and everyone was yelling? What did you see when you went into that woman's house and sat down with her to talk about, her son? And those are things that I feel like, it's not something that we always get access to when, you're watching a reporter on CNN kind of just giving you the news. It's a little bit more personal. And that's, I think, the beauty of audio, is that it's such an intimate medium. And so when we get in the room and we talk to these reporters, it's not just about the story, it's also about the journey that the reporter went on. And you hear that on the daily all the time. Michael Barbara always asking, what was that like when you had that conversation with that woman, and I think listeners love that. I think they love that access to reporters that I don't know that you've always really been able to get, especially when you read a print story or you hear the newscast on the air. It's a little bit more. It's also I think, giving people more access to how we do journalism, which I think is such an important thing, because I think a lot of people don't always understand how the sausage gets made, and how difficult it can sometimes be to go into a city council meeting and everyone's yelling. Where do you go? Who do you talk to? How do you kind of navigate that space? So I think that's a cool thing about how, podcasts kind of makes the storytelling a little bit more intimate.
Could you talk a little bit about, thinking about how the sausage gets made, how the sausage gets made at the Washington Post in terms of this question, when there are so many platforms that the Post is thinking about, when a story comes in, how does it get distributed? Like Josh is talking about in his classes, students pitch an idea and he's helping them think through which platform is maybe most suited. How does that happen in your world?
Well, if you're going to use the sausage is made term, I think that implies that there's a little bit of distrust here. And I think to go back to the fake news question, I think that's what that point made me think of. And yes, you can go on a podcast and you can talk about how you felt when you interviewed that source, and I think maybe readers want to know what reporters are feeling, but you can also show your work in new ways, right? It's easy to put documents online now, and that's something the Post has really been pushing. Is as you have prominent people questioning your legitimacy or the accuracy of your reporting, and you just put stuff online. And just one story of mine that I thought of here is this is a good tech story, because we did I did this story on apps that are on the App Store, the Apple App Store, that allow sexual predators to contact people. These like live chat apps, and they're a huge problem with teens and everything. And Apple, of course, their marketing is that they protect minors. It was the App Store is this clean place. Well, if you look at the reviews on the App Store, there's tons of people reporting this stuff. But Apple makes it very difficult to get those comments, and you can't just scroll through your phone forever to find them. So we actually use a machine learning algorithm to scan the App Store and find the comments that we wanted to get. And we put them all into a database. And when the story ran, we just put the whole database on GitHub. So if anyone doubted our reporting, we could just say, well, okay, go to GitHub and download the database and look at it for yourself. So that's another sort of, this showing the sausage being made example, I think.
Get them. What a great story.
It was a fun one. I mean, fun in quotes.
And you had a video of how you made it as well.
The video actually, involved in it. Every time when you talk to these people and you think you have an interesting story that might be good for a podcast or video, then you got to ask these people, will you talk on camera? Will you go on a podcast? And that's it's an added discussion, and sometimes it feels like more work. Like multi-platform is just multi-work on a story. But it also kind of, I think, sometimes makes you think of different angles for the story, which is good. Because in a print story, like, I'm not really, there are certain things you're just never going to get across in print that you can in video, and vice versa. So when you start thinking about the video, I think it maybe kind of like expands your horizons a little. So that's a good thing.
That's great. So what I'm hearing also with expanded horizons and multi-platforms and these new kind of machine learning specialized knowledge, I hear jobs for our students. And so I wonder if we can go to maybe our closing question before we leave some time for Q&A. Just how can our students, and hopefully you'll speak to this also, having been one of our students recently, how can our students get a tech job in journalism across these many areas? I teach in the theater department, so I don't know.
I don't know that I could speak particularly to how to get a tech job in journalism, but I can speak to kind of my journey of getting a job in journalism, which really started here. I was a student here at San Francisco State, and there is a diversity internship called the Raul Ramirez Diversity Fund Internship through the Journalism Department. I had applied to KQED like over and over and over again, would never get a call back. But there was this special internship specifically for San Francisco State students who come from backgrounds, people who aren't traditionally represented in the news media, and that's how I got in. I applied, and I got to intern at KQED, and that was all that I needed. I just needed that first step in. So student, I spent like 6 months at KQED and just kind of clung on for as long as possible. And here I am. And so, I think particularly like as a young person of color in journalism, I have really found that internships like that and finding kind of solidarity in other people of color who are in the industry, I think in terms of speaking about the future of journalism, I think the future of journalism is more diverse. I think it looks more like San Francisco State. That was my way in. So, and that door is, here and open for all of you. So I would encourage you to apply to that.
You want me to talk about how? I think, the diversity is the future of journalism. I mean, it's hugely important, and I think the Washington Post is always, looking for talented, young, diverse people. So please apply to the Washington Post internship if that's something you're interested in, and also never be afraid to email. I think any journalist, and just say, I really respect your work and I'd love to get some career advice from you. I'm personally, I had a lot of luck with that when I was coming out of San Diego State.
All right, another CSU school.
Yeah,
like
and moved to New York with no job, and eventually got hired as a glorified secretary at the Wall Street Journal back in 2003. And I think, I personally will always take a call from a young journalism student who wants to chat. That doesn't mean I can get them a job, but I can certainly give some advice. So I think you should keep that in mind. And I also think we didn't talk about this at all, but I think technology will eventually enable all these new publications. I spent 4 years working at a place called The Information, which was a subscription-based publication focused on tech news. A bunch of former Wall Street Journal people, and they hire a lot of young people, and it's a great training ground. So there are a lot of options out there. There are more pipelines, but I also wonder about local news. I think you're starting to see some more digital local news startups, which I think also provide huge opportunities because there's no competition. There's just no local news anymore. And I think it's really important. Actually, I would say local news is more important than anything we're covering on the national news front right now. We have lots of people covering national news and no one keeping an eye on local city councils around the country. And, so a couple of ideas.
Yeah. What kinds of portfolios do your students put together, Professor Davis?
Hopefully they put together really good ones. So I like to have my students work on a variety of different types of projects from different platforms. So our students need to be good at writing, they need to be good at audio, they need to be good at video, they need to be good at graphics, but they should be kind of great at one of those things. That's kind of the idea, is that I think there's just so many opportunities out there right now. In journalism, and it changes as new technologies evolve and emerge. So, I like to tell students or people starting out, just be open, be open to changes in the industry, be open to, just like myself, I never expected to work on a nightly news show until I did 20 years into my career, working in print, working as a video for the web, working in multimedia, working in documentary, doing all this different work, and then crashing on this nightly news show at Vice. So you want to just kind of remain open, but also stay open. And, you stay current in the technology, but, have an openness in terms of what you want to do. And so there's like a diversity in jobs, and then there is, the future of journalism is diverse. Like newsrooms need to diversify, are diversifying. And, for folks here, like there are people actively trying to help you like come into their newsrooms and start as interns and hopefully like Ericka, like grow into like producers of these excellent podcasts. So, but have a portfolio and a well-written resume. That helps.
Yeah, I would just say, I could speak to advocacy journalism. I would agree. I agree with everything everybody said. One is you've got to know at least how the different elements work together. And even if you don't excel in that particular area, you have to understand, how it works and how it complements maybe what you do. So I'd say, get really good at one thing and sort of excel at that one thing. I would also say, if one is doing advocacy journalism, it's very important to sort of have a persona, have a tone and timbre that's yours, have a voice that's yours. To ask yourself, who do you want covering what it is that you're doing, what it is that you would like to see get out there. Where are the missed stories? Where are the lost stories? Where are the ignored stories? Right, and then what's the tone and timbre of the publications or the media outlet that you want to cover it. And so then learn how to speak that language, learn how to approach them with that language. Because I lived and worked in Washington, D.C., worked for the federal government for 6 years, I'm fluent in Republican. I don't speak it often, but it's very useful to use in terms of translating what they're saying and figuring out how I'm going to reach larger audiences and audiences beyond what I'm wanting to do or what I'm needing to do. That it's got to be you've got to know what you want to say, how you want to say it, and who you want to reach. And if you haven't figured those three things out, you're going to be less effective at the job you do, no matter where you are within this spectrum that we're talking about.
What field trained you how to do that identifying of audience and voice?
And I'm happy to say I cut my teeth in theater. It was first in high school and then in college. The art of improv is something that as you develop it, you never lose it, right? It's something it's the gift, the dividend that keeps on giving. You got to know how to accept that offer. There'll be reporters who will ask, or you'll ask a question that maybe you don't want to answer, but you've got to work within that framework. How do you do that? Maybe there's a different question you want to ask or you want to answer. You've got to understand how to get from point A where they are to where you want them to be and what the bridge is. Improv helps you do that. Being able to think out of the box helps you do that. Going out on stage in your underwear helps you do that. Because after you've done that, everything else is fairly easy. That it's not quite the hurdle. When CNN calls, I've been on stage in my underwear, I can do this. Right? And so it part of it is challenge yourself, right? To understand what you want your role to be, what the messages you want to put forth there, and then how you want to deliver it, and step outside of your comfort zone a little bit. Because you might discover, how I discovered I really had a knack for audio production was somebody asked me to do a story, and I never had done it before. So then I had to and I did the KCRW audio race, the radio race. And I thought, I kind of like this. I never would have known it, because I was a writer before then, if I hadn't dipped my toe into that pond. So I think, be willing to experiment is very important.
So what I hear is doing a minor in theater is an excellent idea. Take a class. Journalism students, it's wonderful to come and take a class in the theater department, take an acting class, do a minor with us. I have some questions about the underpants heaviness of your training.
Sure.
You don't have that's not how we train in the theater department here, unless you want to do a one-person show.
It was modern dance.
Okay.
So it was, it wasn't technically my
Anything
underwear,
goes.
but it might as well be. Yeah.
Well, this is great, and I would love to have a little bit of time here for some student questions. If anybody's got questions for one of our panelists.
I'm not a student. I'm a journalism educator from Japan and visiting SF State for 6 months.
Konbanwa.
Konbanwa. You regarding the last question about the technology and journalism, I don't know who to ask this question, but do journalism students have a very in-depth, need to have a very in-depth knowledge about engineering, like computer science students, or does that make sense? I mean, if journalism students want to go into the journalism, do they need to have very in-depth knowledge about computer science and how they they put news on different multi-platforms?
Can I address that one? Thanks. I think it helps, but you're never going to be, if you're a journalist, you're not going to spend, whatever the 10,000 hours is coding to become the world's greatest coder. But I think that for me, what's always been helpful in my career is to not necessarily be an expert in the technology, but to think about what technologies are available and might help with my reporting. Because if you're resourceful, you can find the people around you who can help you, bring your vision to reality. And back in, I guess it was maybe 2005, when I was at the Wall Street Journal, and newsrooms doing video projects was still like relatively new. We had some video producers, and I, would come up with these ideas, and we'd produce like these mini documentaries like you're, seeing at Vice now, and they did really well. I didn't really know anything about the video producing side of it, but I had the ideas. And the same is true now with like that machine learning story I did. I found someone on the business side at the Washington Post who was a data scientist and knew how to do this stuff, and worked with him. So I think, it's great if you can code, but I wouldn't be discouraged if you're not a computer science minded person. Just try to understand what can be done with these new things.
And that, I think it sounds like we took similar approaches I make digital adaptations as part of my research. And I don't code. I don't build the digital assets in Maya, and I don't program in Unity. Like you knew what machine learning is, you know what machine learning is, and you know what it can do, but that doesn't mean that you built the program yourself. You knew what kinds of questions could be asked with machine learning and how that applied to the story you wanted to do. I knew enough about what code and building an asset in Maya could do that I went then and found people who were experts in that, and they built things to my spec. So I think for students who are wanting to bring technology into another area of work, that doesn't mean they have to go and get a computer science degree also. It's helpful if they go and maybe take a class so that they understand the kinds of stories that can be told with new technologies, but then they can partner with folks. And I think this recording itself is a great example of finding folks who are good at what they do to work on an event. This would be really meta that MJ, who's standing behind the camera that I'm looking into right now, she's filming and editing, and we're relying on her expertise to make this webinar look great. Not because Professor Davis and I are going to sit down and, although he actually has the chops to do it. I certainly don't, but I knew enough to go and find somebody who was great at it, which is MJ. So thank you, Cameron, for being here. What do you think, Professor Davis?
And I was lucky enough to teach MJ how to do this too. But in all seriousness, I think just in general, like you want to have a natural curiosity, and with that curiosity, if you go in, you don't have to go in and be like, I'm going to go in and be a data scientist for the Washington Post. But we have an alumni from SF State Journalism working at the Washington Post in DC on the I don't know exactly what the team is, but the data team,
on the journalism side.
On the journalism side. And, and that person didn't go in with, all the coding knowledge in the world, the 10,000 hours, right? But they had the curiosity and the interest to learn it and to be like, I want to tell stories this way. So, here, we try to teach here's how you can be good at a bunch of things. Here's also how you can be great at photojournalism, how you can be, great at video, how you can be great at writing. But it's kind of up to you at that point, I think, to what are you most curious about? What do you have the, opportunities to get involved with, and then where do you take it?
Yeah, and that maybe is a great place to close this out so that our folks have a chance to visit with the panelists. They're thinking about what are you curious about? Where are the places that you can take advantage of those many opportunities here at SF State, and then pursue those. We want to support you, both here in the room and the viewers at home. Thanks very much for coming today. Let's give our panelists a round of applause.